You know, in order to get a complete picture of history, you have to be willing to sometimes step out of the box in your area of study. Usually, traditional history focuses exclusively on wars and the rise and fall of nation-states, prominent figures, but in this very special episode, I'd like to deviate a little bit away from our usual topics of study and dive into a rather unique lane of historical discovery. This idea is both cross-cultural and cross-temporal. It's vital to the survival of any civilized society, and for thousands of years, it's been part of virtually all nations and all places. Yet it did not really come to its full level of influence on society until the birth of our country, the United States of America. This unique topic of history is the workforce. You know, hard work is central to the human experience. In fact, as we'll see later in the program, work is actually a God-ordained phenomenon that predates the fall of man. Therefore, like all things God made, it is very good. So with that in mind, let's go back in history, specifically in the history of our nation, and discover the stories of determined workers who built this country into what it is today. We'll look at figures, cultural movements, groups, and technological developments that all, in some way or another, had a part to play in the formation of the American experience. So with that in mind, join me on our journey through history as we discover the topic of this special Moment in History episode, the working man. So the working class has always been part of any functioning society, as I said earlier, but the reality is that in the West, it was often a class that was usually subjected to poverty. So let's go back, starting in Roman times, where the powerful influencers of society were typically politicians and senators and military leaders, and those with some connection to the royal family, be it by blood or by adoption. The rest of the society, which was the bulk, actually made up the working class, and most of which would have been little more than slaves, or would have included slaves, actually. Many of them were slaves, either sold as prisoners of war or intentionally hiring themselves off for indentured servitude. Now, the Middle Ages, though markedly more Christian than Rome at its height, was in reality not a whole lot different in this area. Medieval society was essentially split into two classes. That was the nobility and the serfs. And the nobility would have included knights and their families, but also dukes and earls and princes and kings. Included in this societal aristocracy were also, in somewhat of a surprise to us, churchmen. The pastors of medieval society, which would have been made up of priests and abbots and bishops and archbishops of the Catholic Church, often lived as lavishly as their secular counterparts and wielded as much, if not even more, power. The rest of society made up the working class, the serfs, who could not own land and held very little influence and power over their own destinies, as they worked basically at the mercy of their feudal lords. Now, the first cracks in medieval feudalism began to appear in the early modern age, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, the working class still did not really hold too much power. But in the 18th century, unrest in the British colonies in the Americas would eventually lead to war, and out of that war would come the United States of America. Now, with this new nation, a world-changing ethic emerged, and that was this: the idea that any person, regardless of their background or social status, could have the freedom to pursue the God-ordained rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Part of what made and still makes America such a profound phenomenon is that it was built upon the idea that anyone could be successful and build a wonderful life for themselves and their families if they were simply willing to work for it. Now, perhaps no American in the nation's history embodied this spirit of hard work more than its first president, George Washington. Born in 1733 and raised on a Virginia plantation, Washington was brought up as a military man, a characteristic that would define his life and legacy. He fought in the French and Indian War as a young man in the 1750s, and several years after the war, he would become a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now, as other prominent colonists began to voice their displeasure with the Crown of England's rule over the colonies, Washington joined them. At the age of 43, Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in July of 1775. The colonies were going to war against Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world. For the next 8 years, Washington brilliantly led a smaller, less experienced, and less disciplined army against the mighty British forces to one of the most shocking military upsets in world history. The British formally surrendered at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the colonies were now a free nation of states. The United States of America was born. In February of 1789, Washington was unanimously chosen as the country's first president, receiving all 69 electoral votes. John Adams of Massachusetts was chosen as his vice president. George Washington would serve as U.S. president for 8 years, 2 terms, retiring voluntarily at the end of his second term. He returned to his Mount Vernon estate on the Potomac in Virginia and died in 1799 at the age of 67. So after the American victory in the war, the ideals that founded the nation began to spread as the nation itself began to spread. With representatives in the political sphere, working men and their families now had the freedom to own land and move from place to place if they would so choose. And, move they did, especially when the country doubled its size in the early 1800s thanks to the famed Louisiana Purchase, which was one of the most shrewd economic buys in history. U.S. President Thomas Jefferson orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase with France. The United States doubled in size as a result, adding 827,000 square miles to its surface area for a cheap price of $15 million, or less than 3 cents per acre. Almost immediately, the president called for an expeditionary force tasked with exploring the new land, determining if civilized life in the far west would be possible, and trekking through the Spanish-owned American Far West to reach the Pacific Ocean. This is where we meet Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, 2 Virginia-born military men who would lead the exploration westward. Lewis served as Thomas Jefferson's secretary, and Jefferson chose him to lead the expedition as its chief commander. Lewis then asked his friend William Clark to join him as the co-captain of the exploration. With a party of nearly 50 able-bodied men, most of them unmarried soldiers, the expedition began in Missouri. The men used the Missouri River as their guide. In August of 1804, early in the journey, they experienced their lone casualty as 22-year-old Sergeant Charles Floyd died of an infection that historians believe could have been appendicitis. The Expeditionary Corps met many Native American tribes throughout their journey. It's important to remember that the purpose of the expedition was not to conquer natives and steal their land, but rather to explore uncharted land and open up opportunity for expansion. Lewis and Clark made it clear to their crew that they would seek peace with any natives they countered. They succeeded in large part because of a timely assist from a famous Shoshone Indian woman, Sacagawea. Sacagawea joined the expedition with her French husband as a valuable interpreter for the explorers, and in early 1805, she gave birth to a son whom she named Jean-Baptiste. In November of 1805, the crew at last reached the Pacific Ocean. After camping in the far American West in the winter of 1805 and 1806, the crew began the long journey home. They crossed the Rocky Mountains and parted with Sacagawea in the summer of 1806, and on September 23rd, after more than 2 years, they returned to St. Louis, Missouri. The expedition ended in great success and paved the way for the United States to eventually expand all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. Now, not long after Lewis and Clark returned from their westward expansion, one of the most significant societal changes in world history began to take shape. Now, you have to understand, before the early 19th century, many Western societies, and by Western there, by the way, I mean Europe and the Americas, not just the American West, they were largely agrarian, so industrial advancements were slow and products were created by apprentices and skilled laborers. This was not merely a phenomenon in the early days of America, this was in many ways the way it was throughout history, beginning in the ancient Near East. But in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution overtook the majority of the world. Urban centers, factories, mass manufacturing, and steam-powered engines became the norm. And in the antebellum US, the big land invention in the nation was the train. Railroad tracks began to pulse through the country like a blood vessel, making land travel supremely easier and quicker than ever before. Now, citizens as well as goods could make trips through states in a matter of hours instead of weeks. Finally, during the Civil War, there arose a mass effort to connect the entire country via railroad. Not only did this create opportunities of employment for the working man, it also enabled working individuals to take advantage of opportunities across the rapidly growing continental United States. This campaign resulted in the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. In the 19th century, the world was in transition away from agriculture, which had driven society for thousands of years, and into the age of industry. The primary engine, and that's a pun intended for this push towards industry, was the railroad. Rail travel would revolutionize land transportation and greatly decrease the travel time over long distances of terrain. In the United States, one such railroad brought the country together at an opportune time when the nation was expanding its borders from Atlantic to Pacific. This railroad would connect the center of the continental U.S. to the Pacific Ocean, aptly named the Transcontinental Railroad. Construction began on this particularly massive rail line in 1862 during the American Civil War, originally led by tycoon Theodore Judah's Central Pacific Railroad Company and building west to east. But shortly thereafter, President Abraham Lincoln, with one eye to the far west while his main attention was on saving the country, created some healthy competition by allowing a rival company, the Union Pacific Railroad, to begin building the railroad from the other side in Missouri. With a set amount of money guaranteed to each company based on how many miles they completed, Lincoln had the incentive he needed for a swift completion of the railroad, as both companies fought to gain more mileage than their rival. Now, the building of the railroad was no small task, as both companies had to contend with the southwestern deserts, the Great Plains, and the traversion of the massive Rocky Mountains. Of course, this was the Wild West in the late 19th century, which brought with it the legendary markers of cowboy culture at this time: heists, prostitution, shootouts, duels, and general lawlessness. But finally, in 1869, U.S. President and former Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant decreed that funding would be withheld from the rival rail companies until they agreed to come to a meeting point. On May 10, 1869, a ceremonial golden spike was nailed into the final piece of the connecting Transcontinental Railroad, completing the project in 7 years' time. With the railroad complete and connected to rail systems in the east, the continental U.S. could now be traversed in less than a week, whereas before it would have taken months to cross the country in a covered wagon or on foot.
Navigating through investment options can be challenging, especially when you're determined to uphold your God-given values. Every dollar you invest is a vote for the world that you want to live in. Let your values guide your investment decisions and help to shape the culture in which we live. Become a beacon of light and pave the way with biblically responsible investing. Timothy Plan, where faith and finance collide. Before investing, carefully consider the fund's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of the investment company. This and other important information can be found in the fund's prospectus. To obtain a copy, visit timothyplan.com or call 800-846-7526. Read each prospectus carefully before investing. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal.
When a woman experiences an unplanned pregnancy, she's faced with a difficult decision. Preborn connects with life-affirming pregnancy clinics across the nation and provides them with free ultrasound sessions for expectant mothers. When a mother sees her baby on an ultrasound and hears their heartbeat, it doubles the chance she'll choose life. Visit preborn.com/life to save a baby's life.
Fear and uncertainty can cause us to hold things tightly and rely on ourselves. But during uncertain times, as believers in Christ, we are called to surrender fully to our sovereign God. Learn a biblically responsible investment strategy proven over 25 years. Keep the money God has entrusted to you out of companies that participate in things that God detests. Fully surrender. Become a Financial Issues Partner today.
Now, again, remember the time period we're in. It's the second half of the 19th century. Industry's taking over the Western world in full force. Now, we just explored the creation of perhaps the most important engineering and transportation conduit in American history, but the truth is that the railroad itself, which was the first step in high-speed land travel, was perhaps the chief catalyst behind the industrial explosion of the 19th century, particularly the latter half of the century. Almost overnight, urban centers began to multiply as workers arrived in droves looking for the opportunities to make a life of their own. And in this time period, we also see the beginning of a great wave of immigrants coming into the United States, especially so for refugees from Europe into East Coast cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. You know, it's been said before that we are a nation of immigrants, and this distinction was never more true than in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. The American dream, the idea that anyone could make a life for themselves if they were simply willing to work hard enough for it, as we've already mentioned, came into fruition in this vital period in the life of America, a period known as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age gets its name from famous American author Mark Twain. Like all periods in history, there's no exact time parameters for this period, but many historians believe that it began in the 1860s and lasted until the start of World War I in 1914. And that's important. We'll see why in just a moment. Now, in America, the end of the Civil War is seen as the moment in which this age of industry truly began. Before the Civil War, society in America was still largely agrarian, though it had been gradually moving towards engineering and technology since the start of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century. But in the late 19th century, the focus shifted to the city and factories. Natural materials such as electricity and gas-powered machinery began to drive the engines of society. This was happening throughout the Western world as well, not just in America. Now let's take a look for just a moment at some of the great inventions of the age from this time period. Thomas Edison perfected the light bulb in the late 1870s, which revolutionized the simple need for light at night. He also invented the phonograph in the same decade, which revolutionized audio. The telephone was invented earlier that decade by Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell, which enabled instant worldwide communication and would become the preeminent method of communication only a century later. In travel, the automobile was invented at the turn of the century, and Henry Ford perfected it with his Model T in 1908. The Wright brothers similarly took to the skies, perfecting their first airplane in 1903. Well, it was becoming clear the world would never be the same again. Titans of industry would come to dominate the workforce, where industrial production would win the day over apprenticeship and handmade craft. But it's important to mention that with the advent of mass production also came a newfound plight for the working man. You see, in America and elsewhere in the Western world, it became far too commonplace for major corporations to force their workers into hard working conditions with little pay and almost no benefits and almost no time off. Many workers would be on the job 12 to 16 hours, making little more than pennies, and a great many of them were children. So as a result, the U.S. government passed multiple laws to protect workers' rights, including minimum age and minimum wage requirements, as well as maximum daily working hours and the rise of labor unions. But in the 1930s, Americans faced a potentially catastrophic situation with the Great Depression. At the height of the Depression, which, by the way, infected the whole world, it was not just the U.S. This is often a misunderstood fact of history. 25% of the American population, which came out to over 12 million citizens at the time, was out of work. But as often happens in the course of history, terrible events bring out positive results, as the United States was dragged into World War II after an unprovoked Japanese attack on the Pearl Harbor military base in December of 1941. And though the war was catastrophic, and it absolutely was, it also jolted the U.S. economy out of the Depression with the creation of countless new jobs to help the American war effort. Now, alongside military positions, many jobs were created for civilians to contribute to the Allied cause. History tells us that these workers were instrumental in helping the U.S. citizens serving in the military to gain victory in the summer of 1945.
Do you want to invest in biblically responsible stocks? Financial Issues can help. For only $132 per year, our team of experts will help you make wise decisions with your money and guide you to successful investments that will not dishonor God. You'll also have access to our Portfolio Tracker tool, which will help you keep an eye on your asset allocations, and our Buys and Sells page, which will give you valuable information about biblically responsible stocks. Being a financial issues partner is the best way to invest in accordance with biblical values. Make the most of your money by becoming a partner today. Sign up at financialissues.org. That's financialissues.org.
When I took the test, I knew that I had other options. I was really scared. I know that it's really easy to get an abortion in New York. I've been down the other road before, and it really was a negative experience for me. And it felt like I did it because it made things easier for my partner at the time. And this time I thought, I think I want a different story. I'm just really scared. And she said, we'll take it a page at a time. It felt scary, but it felt like a good thing. I'm gonna have to, if I have this baby, I'm gonna have to do it alone, and that's gonna be really challenging. But I wanted to do it. But I knew that I needed help, and to get around people that would help me, not people who would say, this is a problem that we can make go away. More like, this is awesome and we can help you make it more awesome.
Well, in past episodes of A Moment in History, we've explored at great length the Americans in World War II, the most destructive war in human history. It was a war won on the backs of courageous men who answered the call to protect freedom by taking up arms no matter the cost, as their forefathers in the Civil War and the Revolution had done before them. But we must not forget the impact on the victory in World War II that the average civilian also had. Truth be told, there were countless jobs and duties fulfilled by civilians, both overseas and on the home front, that were instrumental to the victory. Let's explore this vital contribution to the war effort made by a civilian corps of steadfast workers in World War II. Now, the first sphere of this group was the Civilian Defense Corps, created in 1941 by President Franklin Roosevelt in response to the countless air raids by the Luftwaffe on civilian populations in Europe, particularly in England with the Battle of London in 1940. Now, keep in mind, this was before the U.S. officially entered World War II. Recruitment was open to anyone, laborers, housewives, even children, so long as they were able-bodied and of sound mind. But it was not only military defense, a sound infrastructure was also necessary for the war effort. Now, historians believe that World War II was actually the main catalyst that jolted the struggling American economy in the 1930s out of the Great Depression. And indeed, with hundreds of thousands of young men signing up for duty, millions of jobs opened up. Some numbers indicate that well over 15 million new jobs were created in America during the war years. This would have included weapons, tank, aircraft, and shipment manufacturing, mail sorting, creating and supplying goods to the military overseas, and even collecting scrap metal. Now, in a complete contrast to the bleak outlook of the 1930s, America in the war years was largely full of a spirit of optimism, and part of this was certainly the geographical advantage we held over the European counterparts with two oceans to protect us, but another part was indeed this economic regeneration of sorts that brought countless citizens back into the workforce. Furthermore, the country kind of all agreed that regardless of duty, location, or class status, the Axis needed to be stopped and that citizens were willing to do their part to make it happen. They had a common purpose, and that purpose was virtuous and meaningful. Sure enough, this team effort contributed to an American victory in the war in 1945, and as an added bonus, the country then entered a generation-long economic boom in one of its most prosperous times in the decades immediately following the war. Well, you know, the working man has served as a vital part of the growth of American exceptionalism. Not only has the country's prosperity been attributed to the many who have worked for it, but the relationship has been mutually beneficial. This is a country where the average man can have the freedom to work and build a life for themselves and their families. You know, we could spend all day talking about the list of rags to riches stories in America, and you know, it actually includes the likes of many celebrities such as Arnold Schwarzenegger and Dolly Parton. Of course, for us here at FISM, this list would not be complete without the founder and first president of our ministry, Dan Celia. Now, Dan had somewhat of a tough upbringing, but you know, one of the defining characteristics of his life was his work ethic. So after serving in the military during the Vietnam War, he joined the workforce as a bond trader on Wall Street. And from there, he began a trust company that he ran and cultivated with great success for over 20 years, while also becoming an expert in the financial sphere. Now, during this time, as he was also cultivating his young family, he trusted in Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And after over 2 decades in the financial business, he sold his trust company and began a radio ministry where he shared his wealth of knowledge with people all across the country in order to help those who listen to him make wise and God-honoring decisions with their money. Now, one of the core tenets that Dan both lived and preached was that hard work is not only necessary for success, but is actually vital for godliness. You see, work is a pre-fall phenomenon, as we mentioned earlier, and it was instituted by God for human flourishing, and it was pronounced good, and it was only after the fall of man that work became toilsome and harsh, as Genesis 3:15 tells us. But you know, the scripture is clear, work is good. Work is a Christ-like quality. Indeed, the Lord Jesus himself did the work that was set out before him to accomplish his Father's will in perfect obedience. That has to be our goal as well. We must do the same. So as you go about the work that has been set before you, whatever it is, by the way, whether it's for making money or whether it's being a parent or being a student, follow the Colossians 3:23 model and do it to the best of your ability for the Lord and not for men. And that is going to be work well worth your time. As always, folks, I'm Seth Udinski, and thanks so much for joining me once again for a moment in history.
When it comes to money, I always have so many questions. I never know where to go to get answers to those questions. They never really teach you this stuff in school, like some of the best ways to handle it, how to save, when to invest, where to invest, even just what to do with the money. And if I put it in the stock market, what's the best way to protect from losing it all? That fear can be paralyzing. You don't really know what decisions to make. As a Christian, I don't want to give my money to people who are going to use it for things that God hates. When I discovered financial issues, it was like a burden was lifted off my shoulders. Not only did I gain access to a simple investment strategy that I can manage myself, I also have the peace of mind that my money will not be going to companies that actively promote things that God hates. Financial issues has allowed me to experience peace in my investments.
Invest your money in a God-honoring way. Go to financialissues.org.